Monday to do an entire show without hitting record. I know that's going to happen, and I will just shoot myself. All right, here we go. Hey, Hockey World, how you doing? It's Monday, February 9th, 2015.
I'm Kevin Allen of USA Today Sports.
And I'm Eric Duhacek of the Globe and Mail.
And I'm Eklund, and you're watching the Cranky Hockey Writers Show on HockeyBuzz.com. This is the show where Eric, Kevin, and I come to you once a week and try to fix the problems of the hockey world, and quite often do, and have been lauded and thanked at length about it for years now. But anyway, just today we're going to go about another topic, and once in a while, certain stories hit us, and we've got a couple stories, one from each of our co-hosts today that really hit home, and they kind of are connected. We're gonna link them together, but we're gonna start with Eric's story that you wrote. I guess this was on the day was on Saturday, right? Yep, and it was called "The Kessel and Phaneuf Model Conundrum of the Uncoachable Player." And essentially, we heard recently, remember, that came out that Kessel was uncoachable. Ron Wilson said uncoachable, and then we got to the draft, and immediately the joke was the draft for the All-Star game. Kessel, such a coachable player, is drafted first, and it brought out and Eric, you really delved into this nicely. This is such a interesting, bizarre topic and such a subjective thing in so many ways that it's hard to write a really solid, objective story on such a subjective subject. But you really nailed it. I guess start off. Why did you want to write this article? What led you to this?
Sure. Yeah, well, let me give you. I will give you the broad introduction because it is a bit of a long story. Actually, the idea came of a longer story came soon after Ron Wilson went on radio in Toronto and created a real firestorm. Basically, what he talked about Phil Kessel, and I think one of the things that was underreported about this was he actually had some nice things to say about Phil Kessel. Like if you listen to the entire interview, I think it's 8.5 minutes. He talks about the things that Phil Kessel does well and the things that Phil Kessel does poorly. But the thing that everybody seized upon was when he said, that Phil is unreliable. That's essentially what he said. You cannot rely on Phil because he's 2 weeks on and he's 2 weeks off. And so, if you happen to catch Phil during one of the periods where he's on, he's, great and, score a goal game. But then he goes through this maddening level of inconsistency. And then further, after he made that essential point about Phil, when he was asked about the Leafs in general and the team that he had, he said, well, several of these players, and he didn't name Phil specifically in this particular response, but he said several, and the implication was that Dion Phaneuf was one of them, have had 2 or 3 different coaches, and they haven't responded to them. So you might surmise that they are uncoachable. So that's actually the truth of what was said. You might surmise that they are uncoachable. So that was going on for a couple of days, and I wrote a column, a sort of a visceral response to it, and because I have a long relationship with coaches, and I'm interested in coaching myself because I coached my son, and essentially the column originally, which didn't run, was that there is no such thing as an uncoachable player, and I cited at that point 3 examples of players who you might have thought at the start of the season were uncoachable and have proven that that is not the case. And the 3 that I cited were Alex Ovechkin, Dustin Byfuglien, and Mike Ribeiro. And so you have 3 guys. If we had been in September, Alex Ovechkin was coming off a year when he was a horrible defensive liability. Basically got everybody blown out in Washington because he couldn't check. And Dustin Byfuglien has frustrated coaches from the start of his NHL career because of his weight issues and just some other, trying to define what position he played. And Mike Ribeiro, a place where he should have thrived, Phoenix, he didn't for a lot of reasons, including some off. But these are guys that have been handed from, like in the case of Ribeiro anyway, handed from team to team, and it's like, okay, you try because we can't reach them. And then if you look at the success that all 3 are having this year, you would have to conclude that they are, in a lot of ways, coachable. And I remember when Barry Trotz was going into Nashville for the first time, I asked him about Alex, just in general terms, and the first thing he said, without me saying uncoachable, was he's been very easy to coach. Anyway, so that's the premise of it. So I sent it in, and my boss came back and said, I like it. I'd like it explored as a deeper look, and talk to more coaches, talk to sports psychologists, let's discuss, as we are right now, this whole notion of whether players are coachable and uncoachable. So, so I said, okay, good idea. So the story didn't actually run, and I started calling coaches and interviewing coaches as they came through Calgary, and just created a file as I was moving along, and found I was getting fascinating stuff. But the general theme that came through was that there is no such thing as an uncoachable player. Ken Hitchcock was excellent on this.
Yeah.
He said that's a myth. But everybody concluded that there are various degrees of coachability. So that that there are some players that need more work, that are not finished products, and then there are other players that are eminently coachable, and that just don't need instruction, or whatever instruction you impart to them, Kevin. And as I say, I mean, the thing that I liked about it was that that it went in a lot of different directions. Like and I think that like sticking to Phil Kessel, because he was the guy that we started with. Todd McClellan had the greatest comment about that at all, because I said to him, I said, I mean, people talk, Ron Wilson went on the air and talked about how Phil is 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. I said, as long as I've been covering hockey, that has been the history of lots of goal scorers, not just Phil Kessel. And I said, like Patrick Warlow on your team, and he kind of nodded. And I said, when Jerome McGinley was here in Calgary, I said it was always the same, ice cold October, red hot November. And so his response to that, I love the line. He said, well, confidence isn't something that you lose as if it fell out of your pocket at the shopping mall. And I thought, oh, that's a really good way of putting it. Then he went on to talk about the pressure that top players like that are under. Anyway, so that's the long intro to this subject, and it really got into a discussion of what a coach is, as much as anything else, and what a coach does, and how a coach can reach those players that are difficult to reach.
I mean, I love it, Kevin. Your thoughts on this whole concept? It's a big concept, I know, but
Yeah, it is, and really, it's when I hear that, I never take it literally. When a coach, and you do hear it all the time about players being uncoachable, but usually what that means is, I haven't been able to get through to him with regard to having him do what I want him to do. And I think that's always the key, and really, this story is really just about human nature, because it is, just like there are many kinds of coaches, there are many kinds of players, and as Eric alluded to, or as the coaches have alluded to, some require more coaching than others. There are self-starters who, you don't have to say anything to them. They just either instinctually know what to do, or they listen to you and do it, and then you sort of leave them alone, and that's how they perform best. And anyone who's a parent understands that. It's no different than being a parent. And some kids are self-starters and they do what they're supposed to. Some get it and just want to be pleasers, and they do it that way. And then some are just rebellious or don't like authority. And that's what happens with a lot of different hockey players. Everybody shows up, and the majority are in the middle, where they listen to what's asked of them and they perform. And then there are some who simply can't do it. You simply cannot, for whatever reason, do what the coach wants. And oftentimes, one of the things that's never really discussed, but I've always been sort of amused by it, because I've always sort of, kind of sensed it in the background. There is a hockey player or two that shows up every year who is asked to perform like most of us in the hockey world believe a player should behave. And we're talking about willing to play through pain, and put yourself on the line, play get stitches and come back and play. And then every once in a while, a really skilled, talented, cerebral player shows up, and in his back of his mind, when he's asked to dive in front of a slap shot, says, this is nuts. I'm really not that kind of guy. I don't really want to be, feel that level of pain. And it's hard for those guys to come up, because some of them are actually pretty skilled players. And I bring that up simply because I want to point out how difficult it is, and I think this is the secret to being a good coach, is dealing with all those different types of personalities and getting them to perform for you in such a way that you've put together a good team. So, and the other thing that's part of all this is expectations. And coaches all have different expectations. Some coaches, I think, get it, that just as Eric said, and all of us understand this, even if you're a 50-goal scorer, you're not going to get, if you got 1 goal per game, and you know a few games you're going to get multiple goals, you're probably half the season they're not going to get any goals. And you're probably going to go a period where you're not going to get 6 or 7 goals. It's a very streaky thing. So I think some coaches are very understanding of that, also understand that in life everybody's biorhythms are different, and no matter what profession you're in, sometimes you're going well and things are going great, and I don't care whether you're an accountant or an auto mechanic or something else, and then at other times it's not, and they're just more tolerant, and then some coaches just aren't, and there is also personality clashes. Some coaches don't handle rebellious players really well. Mike Keenan loved rebellious players. The feistier you were, and if you came back at him, he loved that. But I think there are other coaches who don't like that.
Yeah, we've seen those too.
I mean, Chris Chelios and Jeremy Roenick have both told me that they always felt that Keenan liked it when you gave it back to him. And now, who would have guessed that from the outside looking in? That you would think that Keenan would not appreciate someone being insubordinate in that regard, and they insist that it's true, that the more you gave it back to Keenan, the more he respected you. So, my point in all this is it's all very complicated. There's no solution for any one given player. You got to sort of read the tea leaves and try to decide how to best get it out of that player. And did anybody really believe that Alex Ovechkin was uncoachable? No.
Yeah.
Is he rebellious? Yeah. Does he not want to play defensive hockey? Yes. But does he want to win? Well, of course he does. He wants to win. So, and I think personality plays a role in it as well, and it's how you approach it. I mean, I think players want to do what Barry Trotz asks because he treats them with great respect. It's like Pat Quinn. When I watched him coach, players respected him. They didn't want to let him down. And some coaches rule through intimidation. So I thought that article was just great because I thought it really kind of set up about how complicated it is, trying to sort through how to get the best out of your team.
Oh, I agree. And a couple things come to mind. First of all, there never seem to be any third or fourth liners who are uncoachable. You'll notice we're always talking about the stars.
Yep.
It's really it brings to mind something that I'm going to tie in the music world for a second. And especially in hockey, and basketball to a degree, I would say is this way too. And there's a good thing about Jordan and basketball in your article too, Eric. But the greatest players in our sport are, in a way, the most artistic and creative players. And those are the ones that really do. They're not just going to put the puck up the boards every time. They're not going to do the same things all the time. They're going to do strange things. They're going to surprise us, and they're going to wow us because they're going to do something that surprises us. Because there's a rhythm to watching hockey. You can watch and okay, this is what happens. This guy's, and then whoa, hold on, what did you just do there? That's something that gets you, right? And it reminds me of musicians, working with musicians, in my day, who were some of the greatest artistic people I've ever worked with were what we might be calling uncoachable here. Where they did their own thing to a degree that was so interesting that you wanted that, but at the same time, that also meant that they weren't going to always listen to you, and they were going to be flaky, and they were going to be odd, and they were going to be strange, and parts of their personality, they weren't going to show up for a gig on time necessarily, but they were so incredible you would let it go, and you just dealt with it, I think that I think there's something to that, Eric. What are your thoughts?
No, it's a really good point. Actually, I wish I'd thought of it when I was writing the piece. Because I think that maybe the response to that is that something that again Todd McClellan talked about is that he says as a hockey coach, he says sometimes we rely too much on the actual game. He says we equip our players with video scouting. We make sure that they're trained properly. We make sure that we give them nutrition advice. We make sure they get enough rest. He says where we sometimes fall down is on the mental side of the game. And he said, and it's a matter of being reactive to a player. You know, like when you can see a player, it's not going for him, or he's in some distress, or something is going on. You know, do we do this enough? Do we sit down and say, okay, what are you going through, and what can I do to help? And I think that is essentially it. I mean, when it comes right down to it. And I guess you have to make the distinction almost between, like, coaching is teaching. Essentially, coaching is teaching. So I circle back to Phil Kessel. Well, somewhere along the line, this guy must have been coachable, because he has at an extreme high skill level. To be able to skate the way he skates, to be able to play the way he plays. You know, he has learned some of the skills of hockey, and that's what you do when you're a kid. So like, skill development is the most important thing from the time you get them at 4 or 6 or 8 or whatever until you get to the NHL. Now, at the NHL level, it's a little bit different. You know, there has been, for especially the players that you're talking about, the stars, the artistic ones, their skill development has reached almost its peak. You know, some of the younger players, they may still have a way to go, but now it's everything else, right? It's everything else. It's being a psychologist, it's being a tactician, it's being a motivator. And I think that's the key is to, when you get a player like Alex Ovechkin coming off a season like he had, Barry Trotz has to sit down, and what does he do? The first 3 hours of their conversation, nothing about hockey. Remember that? Nothing about hockey. He wanted to get to know Alex Ovechkin as a person, so where he's coming from, what his interests are, and he felt that he was better equipped to motivate and to reach and teach Alex Ovechkin once he knew something about him as a person. And I just think that's and so the talented people, they are different. If you learn that about them, and if you learn that maybe they're more sensitive than anyone else. I think you can fairly say, if you watch Phil Kessel at that first NHL fantasy camp, most of the guys that have been picked last since then have the ability to laugh it off and accept the car with and make a joke about it, right? And Phil didn't. Phil was hurt. He was absolutely hurt. In fact, I think he was hurt so much that's why Jonathan Toews made him the first pick, because he was trying to mollify him a little bit. So it's even his peers understood that Phil was different, and to reach Phil and to and to get the message through, that's what needed to happen. And I guess that the other thing is that sometimes it's about language. And I always I told this story to every coach that I interviewed, because I was trying to get them to talk about this. That when I was coaching kids for the first time, I was always an assistant coach because I was traveling so much. And one year we had a very smart man named Paul Gremmel, who was in the oil industry. And remember, after a couple of weeks, he was very frustrated. We were talking. He says, "They're not listening." And I said, "Paul, it's not that they're not listening. I said, they're not comprehending. They're 9 years old, and the language that we are it's not penetrating their psyches. So our task is to seek out a different way of saying the same thing." I said, because it falls on us. It is on us to choose different language that penetrates it. And because Paul was such a smart guy, he took that home with him. And the next week, I remember in the meeting before the game, he got the chalkboard out and he drew a circle around the front of the net. He says, "Okay, boys, from here on in, we are calling this the no puck zone." We were having trouble with our defensive play, and we were giving up too many goals in tight. He says, "When the puck goes into the no puck zone in our end, our only thing that we're worried about is getting it out of there. However we do it, push it out of there, push it corner, move it up, but that is the no puck zone." And then he did, he said, "What is this called?" And you hear 18 kids chirp, "It's the no puck zone, coach."
Right.
and then it made a point, and then he'd say, "Adam, when the puck comes into the no puck zone, what do? We get it out of there, coach." And so it became like this thing for about 2 or 3 minutes. He had it, right? Yeah. Because then that moment on the bench, it's like, the puck's in the no puck zone. Get it out of there. Yeah. So as I say, it was just hard enough to say, okay, what I was saying before wasn't working, and he invented this concept of the no puck zone. And guess what? Our defensive play improved just because of that. So I guess that's a long, rambling answer to the fact that I agree with your point, 100% right. But I do think that sometimes coaches, they can try and say the same words over and over again, because we all have patterns of speech that we fall into. And then if it just happens that a player that you're trying to reach, those patterns of speech don't affect him, then it's up to you. Then it's on you to alter those patterns of speech and find ways that penetrate the cerebellum.
Yeah, I love this. I love this topic.
No, it's interesting too, and I would argue that sometimes a player's coachability really has nothing to do with who's coaching him, but where he is in his life cycle.
Yeah.
And I would say that the best example of that would be Mike Modano. And anybody who followed Mike Modano's career knows that he butted heads with Bob Gainey. And, Mike Modano doesn't really butt heads. He's such a quiet, unassuming guy. And I remember him telling me the story of, Gainey would be unhappy with his one-dimensional play, which is just thinking about moving the puck into the offensive zone and not being a warrior, not back checking, not being a defensive zealot, not being the complete player that Bob wanted him and really needed him to be at that point in his career. And Bob would call him in and he'd say, Bob was a very quiet, reserved man. I'm a very quiet, reserved player. And he would call me into his office to admonish me for my play, and then we would sit and stare at each other for 30 minutes because neither one of us, liked to talk all that much. And, eventually Mike Modano got through all that, and he became, maybe not quite like Peter Forsberg, but he was closer to a Peter Forsberg style of warrior than he was when he started. Now, was it that Bob Gainey really failed, or did Mike just become more confident and more mature? Knowing Bob Gainey, I'm sure he would think that he failed, but I would argue that just Mike wasn't ready yet to handle what the NHL was throwing at him. And I think one of the issues that I've always had with coaches too is, to be successful, you probably have to think like this, but no coach I've ever met ever pays any homage to what the other team is doing. When you hear a Sutter talk, they believe that hard work, it's going to win out over everything else. And sometimes when they're making that speech, I think to myself, I don't care how hard this team works, you're not going to beat that other team because they're the better team. And I remember when I was a kid, and for CYO football, I remember staring at the playbook as the coach was talking about it, and his speech was, each one of these plays is designed so that if everyone on our team does his job, we will score a touchdown. And I remember distinctly saying to the guy next to me, but what he isn't saying is if one guy on the other team does his, we're screwed. And I think that's true in hockey as well. We talk all the time about, Phil Kessel being on for 20 games and off for 20 games. Well, the teams are on the opponents are on for 2 weeks sometimes and off for 2 weeks, and that also explains the inconsistency sometimes that scorers had. But two things I would point out too with regard to this subject. Another player that I think would have been described, especially early in his career, as being uncoachable would have been Joe Murphy, who was obviously a #1 draft pick and went to the Detroit Red Wings. And I wrote a book that was published last fall called with Bob Duff called 100 Things to Know About the Red Wings Before You Die. And in that book, I interviewed Jacques Demers, who said to me the greatest and really only regret he had in his career is how he handled Joe Murphy. And he said, if I ran into Joe Murphy today, I would apologize to him for how I treated him. Because he really takes blame in his own mind, and this is how coaches think, because Joe Murphy really didn't become the player that was expected he would be. He was not the dominant offensive player. As it turned out, Joe Murphy actually had a pretty decent career, just not as a great offensive star. And Demers thought that he just didn't handle him well. That, he looks back on it now and he said he was too hard on him, that Murphy needed a kinder, gentler coach. And at that point, he had a veteran team, and he pushed Murphy too hard. He rode him too hard. He tried to make him conform when really he was just too young to sort of figure it out on his own. And here's a player who I think was considered uncoachable for a while. And now we hear years later with Demers said, he was coachable, I just didn't coach him correctly. Now, whether that's true or not, is that really just Demers, nitpicking his own career and looking for one regret? And then the other story I would tell about that as well, which really fascinated me. Is I did a lengthy interview with Scotty Bowman one time about coaching. It was years ago, and I asked him about getting the most out of players, and he said, "Well, if you have a 30-goal scorer and he scores 20 goals, he said you've failed." I said, "Really?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "It's your job to get the most out of your players, and that's all they ask you to do, as a coach, is to get the most out of your players. So if you know your guy should score 30 and he only gets 20, it's not his fault; it's your fault." And that's how we viewed things. Now, that was stunning to me to hear Scotty say that, because, but I guess that's why he was successful. That's why he's a Hall of Fame coach. That's why he's probably the greatest, coach in NHL history. But everybody has a different sort of perspective on coaching, and
oh, you really see it in this article, and you're right, Kevin, with what you're saying. I mean, and I think what is also fascinating about this and what in our discussion in general is it should be the mandatory listening or reading for anybody who's coached a youth sport, because really that you really see all the different levels. One of the most interesting things in my life over the last 3 or 4 years has been as an assistant soccer coach for my daughter's travel team, and it's been absolutely something I've loved. I mean, of all the things in my life, it's one of the top 10 things I've enjoyed doing. It's just one of these things I really, and I'm an assistant coach. I don't know squat about soccer. Didn't 4 years ago. I know more about it now. I'm with a guy who's the head coach who was a college soccer player, really solid soccer player. But I do know about people, and I do know I can do the psychological part, and I can be the good assistant, and help with it. But we've had players that we would call uncoachable. We've had players who are way more talented but not getting anything. We have players who are small and no one will take them because they end up on our team because they're smaller, but they end up becoming absolute pit bulls. And you see it, and you see basically that's to me the most fascinating thing about all of this is that you really do have to get down to the root of what each player wants. You have to know what each player's motivation is, and this is 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old girls. They're going through a lot in life. They're changing. They're emotional. They're more, and yet they've grown up together in this one particular team, and they don't go to the same schools together, but they're on this one travel team. And it's a fascinating culture to watch. I mean, one of the things we did last year, to your point, was we were losing games because we're the kind of team that has to play. Everybody has to play full out. We don't have the stars that are going to score 1 or 2 goals that are going to get us through a soccer game, which in soccer is a big deal. We have to be a team game. And so one of the things I did last year was count battles. Our goal was to win 50 battles a half. And I said if we win, and so I will yell out numbers randomly. I'll yell 32, and everybody on the field knows we're at 32 battles for that half. Or I yell 64. Yeah. And they if they can get to 100 battles, I said I promise you'll never lose a game you win 100 battles in, and that's always been true. If you can win 100 battles, and that the battle is just every time you come up, you and another player are battling for the ball. If you come out with it, I'll that's one for you. And that little thing, just something as stupid as that, changed the whole season around. It just completely brought them together and enabled them to do something like you said, get the puck out of the zone, something simple, something easy.
Yep.
And that made such a difference. And even the players I found that were the star players, who really just think about scoring and don't want to win battles, got into it, and they got into the simplicity of it all.
Yeah, see, that's not stupid at all. That's smart. That's really good coaching, because you evaluated a situation, you evaluated your personnel, and you came up with a solution that worked. And to me, that there is the essence of coaching. One of the great things that Todd McClellan said that in terms of what I was talking about before too about language, was that even at the NHL level, like, it's hard enough to reach kids like that. He says, but at the NHL level, he says, we use terms. What do they mean exactly? So he said work ethic. He says everybody has a different idea of what work ethic is. You can get somebody like Jamie Islip, who used to play in Calgary, who could do 300 sit-ups. He could do sit-ups for an hour. When he was doing fitness testing, they had to stop him because he was this manically fit guy that's all he did and all he cared about. And then somebody else could come in and not do 10. And so, but both guys think that they've come to training camp in shape, right? Each of them has a different idea of what work ethic is. Mm-hmm. He said discipline. He says, what does discipline mean? He says, for some people, it's just, don't take bad penalties. He said, sometimes discipline is being smart about the game. He said he gave Brett Hull as a good example. Kevin will appreciate this. He said, we always tell players, when you're in a slump, go to the net. go to the net. He says, well, if and he was Todd was an assistant in Detroit. He says, if we had said to Brett Hull, okay, just go to the net, we would have taken away the one thing that he does best in the game, which is find that quiet area in the ice and just appear and then get the puck on his stick and find the little hole to put it in. He said, so that's you can't. Some players, the best advice is just go to the net because that's where they're going to score goals. Gary Roberts, scored 52 goals. Why? He went to the net. Sergei Makarov put it on his stick 40 times that year. Brett Hull, if you tell Brett Hull to go to the net, you are being counterproductive. You are giving him wrong coaching advice, and that's the other thing. Sometimes coaching advice can be wrong. You have to be able to evaluate the players at hand and say, okay, in the case of this preternaturally talented athlete, go to the net is the wrong thing to say. It's do what you do, which is find the quiet ice and continue to score the goals. And so I mean it's really interesting. I think you really hit on something there, and that's maybe we should write a coaching handbook because I think we can probably pull 10 different stunts out where players have that light bulb moment, and that's the most fun thing as a coach, isn't it? When something works. I remember we used to work on a face-off play, and the idea, real simple, get the draw back, shift the winger over in a scoring position, win the draw directly to him, score off the face-off. And we got to about game 30, and we'd been working on it all year. And all of a sudden, draw goes, guys shoot, score, and I turned to Paul, and it's like, hey, the face-off play worked. There is nothing better than when the face-off.
We just scored on a corner kick. I know we had that. We had that last week. We just scored on a corner kick. We practice corner kicks every single.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to raise one more thing because I think it's a good transition to where we're going next, which is something that Ken Hitchcock said, which I also really agreed. Ken was an assistant coach on Canada's men's Olympic hockey team, and we started talking about players like Drew Doughty and Jonathan Toews specifically, but players like that. And he said this, and I really liked it. He said, there are guys who play hockey, and then there are hockey players. And he said, Drew Doughty is a hockey player. Just gets it. And he didn't use the term savant, I did, but that's essentially what he means. Some players require very little coaching, and some just have a natural instinct for the game. And he said, they understand the moment, they understand the stage, you tell them once, and they get it, and they do it. And the reason we were talking about Doughty was because he has to play one way in the NHL for Daryl Sutter, because the Kings are primarily a defensive-oriented team. So they just don't have permission to go on the attack. So he is primarily a defenseman in the LA Kings scheme of things, and that takes away sometimes from the points that he scores at the NHL level. You get to the Olympics, the key to the Canadian approach there was activating the defense, going to the attack. And so the defensemen were constantly up on the play because they were trying to get, odd man rushes. And basically the offense on that Canadian team that won the gold medal in Sochi a year ago a lot of it was the defenseman. Doughty led the team in scoring. Shea Weber was, I think, second. And it was because they played a certain way. So here's a guy that had to, on a dime, turn the way he plays in the NHL and play a completely different way in the Olympics, and he did it seamlessly. And there are guys that are like that. Doughty is like that. Jonathan Toews is like that. Sidney Crosby is like that.
Yeah, and Kevin wrote a great story on Crosby, and I love that. I think it is the perfect transition on a couple levels. Also because of the idea here too that we're talking about artistic players. And sometimes, this goes back into our discussion we had on captains, which I think was our third or fourth episode, where, some guys are made captains, and if that captain is a super talented player, but more of an artistic kind of, for lack of a better word, whifty type, player who's all over the map, that maybe is not the best captain. But sometimes you end up with guys who are so talented and yet so focused and balanced at the same time, and that is Sidney Crosby. I mean, you got a chance to sit with him, Kevin, and a lot of people, he's such an interesting character. What were your initial, tell us a little bit about the article and the impressions.
Well, this came actually, the idea to do the story came from above. Our sports editor said, hey, it's probably time to sit down and write a piece about Sidney Crosby, about who he really is. I mean, we all know, who cover the sport, that he's almost, it's hard to describe, because for as great as he's been and for what a terrific ambassador, when you write a story, if you read the comments, there's the pro-Crosby group and the anti-Crosby group, and it's really even hard to even explain, why that is. And, she had read some of the comments and realized that This is a pretty fascinating character. And she said, I don't know a lot about him, so why don't you go and see what you can find out? And so I've known Sidney since he was 17. I went up to Rimouski, and my idea was, hey, Sid, it's been 10 years now, as hard as it is to believe, that since you came to Pittsburgh, let's sit down and talk about what your expectations were and how this worked out. And my second layer to the idea of the story was, he probably landed in the perfect place for his personality. And we explored that. And I said to him a little bit, could this have worked out any better? Because Pittsburgh is sort of a big city with a small town feel to it. And I remember his quote that's in the story was perfect, where he basically said, he likes to visit New York a lot. It's an awesome city, he said he called it. But, it's too busy for him. But he also wouldn't want to live on a farm somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And so, Pittsburgh is just right for him. And it's the kind of city that gives its superstars some room. They leave him alone a little bit. He gets some time to himself, and I think that's important. He can't do that, obviously, in Canada. So if he had gone to Toronto or Montreal, for example, he would have had no privacy whatsoever had he played in those cities. So, we talked a lot about he told me just a great story, too, about going through the interview process. Because if you remember, we had a lottery, so he interviewed with all 30 teams.
Right.
And I said to him, do you remember any question that was asked of you? And he said, oh, for sure, I remembered one. And the New York Rangers asked him, and he believed, as he recalled, it was a psychologist that was part of their group, asked him, if you could take a pill that would guarantee you would win a Olympic gold medal and a Stanley Cup by the time of age 25, but then you would die, would you take that pill? And he said at the time, he realized what the Rangers were doing. They were trying to gauge, what kind of team player he was, and he saw through it. But it was sort of like in the movie with the computer that the best solution is not to play at all. But Crosby's a player and players play, so he played along. Yeah. And what he said was, no, I wouldn't take the pill because I plan to win multiple cups and Olympic gold medals. Now, obviously, he hasn't won multiple gold medals or Stanley Cups, but he has won multiple gold medals. So he has fulfilled that. And, I don't know that because of the way social media is today, I don't know that any NHL superstar has faced the pressure that Crosby has faced. And, he's done a remarkable job. He's been undermined by injuries, to say the least, and he still, I think, even in this era, distinguished himself, and through focus and balance. He tries to say the right thing. It doesn't always work out for him, but he does as good of a job as you could do, given his circumstances, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree, and the social media thing is really smart for him to sort of, like, in your article you say he says he's a participator, but he reads but doesn't write. He reads Twitter because he likes to enjoy that. And in your comments, Kevin, it's funny because I recently read a social media. There's tons of these social media psychology things. People are out there getting their PhDs on this stuff right now. Trust me. And there's a guy out there who wrote an article recently that they did a test on Twitter of people who had relatively big followers, and they said they wanted them to ask one thing or another. And one thing was they would ask for help. Like, I need help trying to figure out who is this person or who's that. I can't remember, or I need help money-wise, right? I need help in some way, shape, or form. And the other was to write a tweet with a misspelled word. Those were the two things they had to do. All right. And what he found was 5 times more responses to tweets with misspelled words than asking for help. So that tells you a lot about social media right there, right? The other story they did was they had him write an actual story about the most plain story you could possibly imagine. My 5 favorite movies of all time. All right, just a simple story like that, and then he did a whole paper on every negative response to someone's article on their 5 favorite stories of all time. Like how you could absolutely get torn apart just for simply sharing your 5 favorite movies of all time.
Yeah. I got to share this story, even though it's not hockey related, but I think we will all appreciate it, especially those of us who are in the business. who have been trolled. I read a story by a columnist who writes on women's issues, and her slant is feminist, and she takes on very difficult issues, rape, abuse of women, and because of that, she has just been crucified by trolls. And she said it's difficult, and she has learned over time to just ignore them. But one of them went so far that it put her over the edge, and that was a guy who actually researched through her Facebook and found their dad was deceased, and opened a Twitter account in her deceased father's name, and then trolled her from that account with ideas of, I have 3 children and she's the only one who's a screw up, and went after her, and really bothered her, as she said, sort of put her over the edge a little bit. And she happened to mention it, and not right away, but in a column a couple months later. And about 2 months later, she got a letter from the guy, and said that when he read her response and how horrible she felt about it, it made him take stock of his own life. And as it turned out, he had trolled her, and it wasn't over any particular article. And when he sat down and sort of figured out why he was so upset with her, he realized that he just didn't like how good she felt about herself and her life, and it was reflected in her columns, because he just wasn't happy with his own personal,
Wow.
And he ended up making a charitable contribution to the hospital that treated her father. He pledged to her that he would never ever troll anyone ever again, and said that she had just changed his life. And her response was to write another column and said, I guess it just, that maybe trolls just need to be heard, and they're seeking something. So her last line was, "Keep screaming, trolls, I hear you." Which I thought
that's a great story. And they definitely are.
A great story.
They definitely are. I mean, and moving before we get right back to Crosby, I mean, I've had people troll me. We all have had people troll us. And my favorite thing to do with trolls is I've responded to them asking for their phone number, and I've called them up. Just if you call up a troll, if you just call them up on their phone, you're amazed at what they'll say to you. They'll just be like, oh man, I love your stuff. Had a bad day. Sorry, I didn't mean to do. And it's completely different people, and so we have to realize it's. But so Sidney stays out of that, and it's a good thing that he does, because can you imagine a Sidney Crosby Twitter account?
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. I mean, he did say he's aware of the fact that he's a lightning rod, and he said, I know just by going in the arenas, so. But
yeah.
I mean, he told the story, and actually, Pascal Dupuis told me that when they're in Canada and Sid hangs out with his Penguins teammates, they have to go into restaurants in the back door, and they have to seek out a place, and even then they're probably interrupted 4 or 5 times for each course of the meal, and it's it's difficult. So
incredible, Eric. You see this all the time, obviously, and especially the first couple times Sidney came through Western Canada, especially, it felt like the Pope was coming there. I just remember this whole thing. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, he was just through Western Canada. He was here on Friday. He was in Vancouver on Saturday. He was in Edmonton earlier in the week. And then, it's funny though. Speaking of the restaurant thing, I'll just tell you an anecdote about the very first Olympic camp they held here. I remember going to a downtown restaurant called Joey Tomatoes, which is in Eau Claire, near where the team was staying, and I'm just going out with a bunch of writers after a Team Canada practice, and the players were all in a corner of the bar having dinner, and Crosby was at a table there, and I watched for hours, and no one. This is when he was just breaking into the game. No one bothered him. No one bothered him. This was 2005, I guess, and it was the Olympic team he didn't actually make. But I thought to myself, wow, I don't know if this is going to last, but it's amazing how respectful people were. They knew who he was, and again, he was just starting to become Sidney Crosby. So probably that isn't the case anymore. But when they were through Edmonton last year, just before the Olympics, I went up there, and they had 3 days of in Edmonton, and I was trying to do a longer piece on him and on Malkin going into Sochi and playing against each other after being teammates for all this time, and what that would involve. And then we just talked a little bit about what Kevin was talking about. There were kids lined up outside the dressing room with their Crosby paraphernalia waiting for autographs, and I said, how do you do this? How do you handle this? And are you aware of that? And he said, yeah. He says, you can tell. You walk into a restaurant and you can hear a murmur or a buzz. And he says, but mostly people are pretty respectful of it. They'll sometimes come up and ask for an autograph, but a lot of times people just sort of are he says you can see with their phones, they're tweeting something out. But to me the most amazing thing is that he is still a young man, and that throughout his entire career he has been able to deal with sort of that kind of awareness, and that's I suppose that's what the biggest Hollywood stars have to deal with too, that you concede early on that you're probably not going to have a normal life, and so how do you handle that, and does it affect you in a negative way? And again, it comes back to coaching, but also sort of I think the depth of personality and how they were raised, and the actual confidence that they have. Like you run into people in this world, and they appear to be confident, and as you get to know them, you realize that what appears to be confidence is actually bluster, and in fact they are not confident at all, and they mask this lack of confidence behind a public persona that involves a whole lot of here I am and look at me and that kind of a thing. And then there's true confidence, which I call quiet confidence, and that's what Crosby has. And I think you can see it in the way he acts off the ice, and I think more importantly, you can see the way he is on the ice, because he is a guy that just I think understands that some nights it doesn't go in. They got shut out by Vancouver the other day, and he's just going to come out the next night, and it's not going to affect him. And that's something that Sean Horkoff told me earlier this year in a piece that I was doing about Tyler Seguin. And he said, I've played with a lot of the stars and the superstars of the game. And he said, that's what separates them from the rest of us. That no matter how bad you might play in a certain game, no matter how it didn't go your way, they are confident in the extreme that it's just an aberration and they'll be good again the next night. And he said, and that's what you have to play at the highest level, and that's what he was talking specifically about Tyler Seguin, but I would suggest it applies to Crosby too. He just knows that it didn't go for them well for them on Saturday in Vancouver. It'll be fine the next night out.
Wow, that's interesting, and it ties into coaching too. I mean, that's a good coaching thing to teach players who are in that spot to be confident about that. To have that whole thing, to think that they can come back from it. I mean, I thought one of the most interesting quotes, and Kevin, I think it's a good way to end the podcast, is what he talked about Phil Kessel in your article. He talked about the Phil Kessel situation, and when he went after the reporter.
Yeah, and he brought that up on his own. That was not in a response to a question that I was talking to him about dealing with the media, but he used Phil Kessel as an example. And basically what he was saying is that when he heard the Phil Kessel story, he had sympathy, empathy for Phil Kessel, because he knows how that can be. That oftentimes he said he'll hear a question and he doesn't even agree with the premise of the question, but he's obliged to answer that question. And he said it can be infuriating to have to be in that situation. And he said it was just human nature. So he said he felt sorry for Phil being in that position. But saying all that, as I point out, that's the one thing that I also marvel at. You can, like last year during the playoffs, he was asked, every day whether he was hurt. And a lot of players, after about the 1,000th time they've been asked that, they get a little testy about it, but he never did. He answered the same question every day. He answered it the same way and just moved on, because that's his personality. So I think his personality has kind of served him well in this role, because this is not something he had to learn how to do. This is really who he is. Like the team president David Morehouse said, when he comes into your house, he takes his shoes off. He's just that kind of guy. And I thought it was interesting too, a quote that really kind of summed up his personality. I asked him about how it's different for him as opposed to just a regular person. He goes, well, I can't really go to a movie at 7 o'clock on a Friday night. He said, but here's the thing that people don't really understand, is that even if I wasn't a hockey player, I really wouldn't want to go to a movie at 7 p.m. on Friday.
Right.
I'd want to go at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And he said, I don't shop after December 10th because I don't like the crowds at the mall. Not because I'm Sidney Crosby. That's just my personality. And I just thought that he's just sort of a small town guy who's learned how to deal with it all, and I think does a really remarkable job of trying to do. And in this regard, he's been a lot like Wayne Gretzky in his ability to try to always do the right thing. When he was 17 years old, I reminded him of this too, and he laughed because he knew what I was talking about. Is when he was in the Quebec League, he would go from city to city, and there would always be a couple 100, 300 people waiting outside for him to sign autographs. And I was doing a big story, so I was following him around, and I said, "What's the hardest thing about this?" And he goes, "Trying to strike a balance." Now remember, he's 17 years old. Trying to strike a balance between fulfilling my obligation to fans and not making my teammates inconvenienced by my obligations. Now, what teenager thinks like that? Nobody does. But that's really, kind of Sid's personality. That's who he is. He's a very respectful person. He treats the media with respect. He treats his teammates with respect. He treats his fans with respect. He tries to do the best he can at all times, and and he's been a good hockey player. Every year, it's a running joke between us because I always go to do my Sidney Crosby piece. Obviously, he's a popular player, and always my question is, all right, what are you working on this year? And every year, for the 10 years, he's had something different than he's working on, and he's always improved on it. So, like, I remember one year I did a story about he wanted to be better on faceoffs, and that's the year he got, really good at it. And he wanted to score more goals, and he scored more goals. He wanted to be a better defensive player. So, he's always done that, and it's sort of a running joke with us that he knows when I come to town I'm going to ask him, and he's always prepared to give me that answer to what he's been working on, trying to improve.
That's a superstar right there. That's a superstar through and through. That's like Will Chamberlain in Philly, who, after he led the league in scoring, everybody said, "Oh, you can only lead the league in scoring because you're big." And then next year he led the league in assists just for the hell of it.
Yeah.
And that's what a superstar can do, right? They have that ability to play with you. Well, this was a great show, guys. Really fantastic. Definitely, I'm going to put links to both these articles, both the Uncoachable, Are You Uncoachable article, basically by Eric, and the Sidney Crosby article from Kevin. They're both fantastic reads, and we'll be back. We'll be back soon, guys. So remember, without the buzz, it is just hockey. Talk to you later.